We have some breaking news that we are very sorry to report, and that is that Dolly Parton has died.
Dolly Parton rose from almost unimaginable poverty to become one of America's most powerful and beloved entertainers. Born into a family of 12 in Tennessee's Smoky Mountains, she transformed a childhood of hardship into more than 3,000 songs, a fortune estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars, and a legacy recognized around the world. Her blonde wigs and rhinestones were not merely an image. They were the armor of a poor girl from Locust Ridge who refused to let anyone else define her. But on August 21st, 2026, just 4 days before her death, Dolly acknowledged that she had not been well. Months of dizziness, dehydration, kidney stones, canceled appearances, and limited travel had raised growing concern. Still, she continued working, just as she had since arriving in Nashville with little more than a guitar and an extraordinary dream. What was really happening during Dolly's final months? Why were so few details revealed before her death? And how did a girl who once had almost nothing build one of the greatest fortunes in country music? The answer begins with a decision that revealed the woman beneath the rhinestones. When Elvis Presley wanted to record "I Will Always Love You," Dolly refused to surrender half of its publishing rights. She lost the opportunity, but protected the song that would later help secure her empire. Before we uncover Dolly's final months and the choices that shaped her remarkable fortune, tell us in the comments which of her songs touched your life most. Please like and share this video so others can join us in honoring her memory. And leave "Rest in Peace, Dolly" as a final message of love for a legend the world will never forget. 4 days before the world learned that Dolly Parton was gone, she said something that, in hindsight, sounded less like an update and more like an admission. On August 21st, 2026, speaking quietly to People magazine, there was no glittering stage around her, no rhinestones catching the spotlight, no microphone separating the legend from the woman. For once, Dolly was simply talking about herself. "I am dealing with some health issues," she explained, admitting that she had failed to pay attention to her own body while caring for Carl Dean, the husband who had shared 58 years of her life and had died earlier that year. For months, Dolly had devoted herself to Carl, watching over him, caring for him, and remaining beside him through the final chapter of their marriage. And somewhere inside that long goodbye, she had done what she had spent much of her life doing whenever pain arrived. She pushed her own needs aside and took care of someone else first. It was almost instinctive. The woman who had spent decades giving comfort to millions had once again placed herself at the bottom of the list. But the health problems she finally acknowledged were not entirely new. In the months leading into August, reports had described struggles with dehydration, dizziness, and kidney stones. Conditions that had begun forcing an 80-year-old woman famous for seemingly endless energy to confront something she had resisted for most of her life: stopping. Appearances were canceled. Travel was reduced. Rest was no longer optional. After more than 6 decades of constantly moving forward, her body was beginning to demand what Dolly herself rarely did. The warning signs had been there before. In September 2025, she had spoken about needing what she casually described as a few procedures. Even then, she delivered the news in unmistakable Dolly fashion, with humor, understatement, and that dry acceptance that could make something serious sound almost ordinary. She had spent a lifetime learning how to soften difficult truths for everyone around her. But beneath the lightness, something was changing. And by August 2026, only days before the world would receive devastating news, Dolly Parton was finally admitting that while she had been watching over the man she loved, she had stopped watching over herself. On August 25th, 2026, the announcement the world had never wanted to hear came from someone Dolly Parton had trusted with her safety for more than 2 decades. Brian Siver, her nephew and longtime head of security, following in the footsteps of his father Larry before him, appeared in a video carrying a responsibility Dolly herself had placed in his hands years earlier. He chose his words carefully, visibly aware that this was not simply another family statement. "This video announcement," he explained, "is something Dolly asked of me years ago. Long before he could fully imagine the day when that request would become real, she had already prepared him for it. In many ways, that was unmistakably Dolly. Throughout her life, she had prepared for possibilities others preferred not to think about, arranging details, anticipating what might come next, and rarely leaving important things to chance. Apparently, her final goodbye was no exception. Even the announcement of her death had been considered years in advance, entrusted to someone she loved, and delivered with the same quiet precision that had shaped so much of her extraordinary life. What remained unanswered was exactly what had taken her. Brian Siver did not disclose a cause of death, nor did her publicist. As of August 25, 2026, the official cause remained undetermined while the medical examiner in Sevier County, Tennessee, continued its review. The family confirmed only what had already become increasingly clear during her final months. Dolly had been struggling with her health, and she had not been well. Then Brian offered the only explanation that seemed to matter to those closest to her. Dolly, he said, was now in the arms of Jesus, surely reunited with Carl, with her parents, and with the countless loved ones who had gone before her and waited to welcome her into heaven. Beyond that, the family chose silence. No speculation. No attempt to turn her final hours into a spectacle. Perhaps that restraint was fitting, because however Dolly Parton's life ultimately ended, the cause written on a medical examiner's report could never explain the woman herself. The ending was only a moment. It was never the story of Dolly Parton. At 13, while most children her age were still trying to imagine what adulthood might look like, Dolly Parton had already recorded her first single for a small label based in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Music was no longer simply something she sang in church or dreamed about in the mountains. It had become a destination, and every small opportunity seemed to point toward the same place, Nashville. Then came the summer of 1964. Dolly graduated from Sevier County High School, becoming the first member of her family to earn a diploma. For a family of 12 children raised with so little, that piece of paper represented something larger than graduation. It was proof that one of Robert Lee and Avie Lee Parton's children had reached a place the generation before her had never been allowed to reach. But Dolly barely had time to celebrate. The very next day, she packed everything she believed she needed into a single bag, boarded a Greyhound bus, and left the mountains behind. She later remembered that her entire hometown seemed to come out to watch her leave. Imagine that moment. 17 years old, one bag in her hands, the people and mountains that had shaped her disappearing behind the window of a bus carrying her toward a city that had made her no promises. There was no record contract waiting in Nashville, no powerful manager preparing to open doors, no family fortune to catch her if she failed. There was only a young woman leaving behind nearly everything familiar because somewhere inside her was the stubborn certainty that the life she imagined existed and that she had to go find it. Nashville in 1964 was not waiting for Dolly Parton. For years, she worked from the edges of the business, writing songs for other performers, pitching material wherever someone would listen, and quietly studying the machinery of an industry built to reward those who already possessed money, connections, and leverage. Dolly had none of those things. What she did have was an education poverty had given her long before any classroom could. She understood what happened to people who did not know the rules. She had grown up watching adults work brutally hard and still remain vulnerable because they could not read the contracts placed before them, did not understand the systems surrounding them, or simply lacked the power to challenge the people who did. Her father had signed legal documents with an X. Dolly never forgot what that meant. So she watched. She listened. She learned who owned the songs, where the money went, what signatures meant, and why the person creating something was not always the person who ultimately controlled it. She absorbed the business with the same determination she brought to songwriting, because she understood that talent might get her through Nashville's door, but talent alone would never protect what she built once she was inside. Dolly Parton learned the rules, and then she learned how to rewrite them. By 1967, Dolly Parton had earned the opportunity that would carry her from Nashville's margins into living rooms across America. She joined the Porter Wagoner Show, a nationally syndicated television program that gave millions of viewers their first regular glimpse of the young singer from the Smoky Mountains. Porter Wagoner gave her a platform when she desperately needed one, and Dolly never denied the importance of that opportunity. But Porter would also become the first great test of something far more important than her talent: whether Dolly Parton could remain the owner of herself once other people began believing they had created her. In Porter's estimation, he had discovered her. In time, he would also come to believe that he had built her. He was wrong on both counts, although it would take years and considerable pain for that truth to become undeniable. Dolly had been building herself long before Porter Wagoner knew her name. What television gave her was not an identity, but a larger stage on which to refine one. It was during these years that the Dolly Parton the world would recognize began taking deliberate shape. The towering wigs, eventually numbering more than 100, and kept cataloged and maintained in their own dedicated room, were not simply exercises in vanity. They were practical. They meant she could prepare quickly, survive the heat of outdoor performances without worrying about her natural hair, and walk into almost any environment already camera-ready. More importantly, wherever Dolly appeared, there could be no confusion about who had entered the room. She was instantly, unmistakably herself. Or, more precisely, the version of herself she had consciously decided the world was allowed to see. Then came the long nails, the rhinestones, the exaggerated curves and layers of makeup applied with an artist's precision and a comedian's awareness of the joke. Dolly understood exactly what people saw when they looked at her, which was why she could laugh before anyone else had the opportunity. "It takes a lot of money," she once confided, "to look this cheap." It was funny because Dolly intended it to be funny, but underneath the joke was an entire philosophy about image, control, and survival. The image was expensive, calculated, and, in its own peculiar way, protective. It was the rhinestone descendant of the coat her mother had once stitched together from scraps on Locust Ridge, pieces carefully assembled until something born from necessity became beautiful enough to withstand the cold. Yet Dolly never confused the armor with the woman wearing it. The blonde hair, the glitter, and the impossible proportions were part of the character. Dolly Parton was the woman who had created that character and understood exactly what purpose it served. "I'm not offended by all the dumb blonde jokes," she would later say with the serenity of someone who understood herself too well to be wounded by a stranger's assumption, "because I know I'm not dumb, and I also know I'm not blonde." If the image was what protected her, the songs were where she allowed herself to be exposed. Across 6 decades, Dolly wrote more than 3,000 of them. She often rose at 3 or 4 in the morning, before telephones rang, before meetings began, and before the machinery surrounding Dolly Parton the celebrity could demand anything from Dolly Parton the woman. Those dark, silent hours belonged to her. That was when melodies arrived and memories returned, and she wrote on hotel napkins, on the backs of envelopes, or on whatever happened to be within reach when an idea refused to wait. She wrote about love and abandonment, God and loneliness, poverty and dignity, her mother and the Smoky Mountains, heartbreak, resilience, desire, and joy. She wrote with the persistence of someone who seemed to regard songwriting not merely as a profession, but as an assignment handed to her by something larger than ambition. Fame could be managed, costumes could be changed, and wigs could be removed at the end of the night. But the songs came from somewhere she could not disguise. "My songs are my diary," she once admitted, and across more than 3,000 songs, she left thousands of fragments of herself translated into melody and verse. Beneath all of those songs was one decision Dolly had made long before anyone understood how important it would become. She intended to own what she created. That ownership did not come because Nashville generously handed it to her, because she happened to negotiate the right contracts, or because luck repeatedly landed on her side. She protected her work because she insisted on doing so. with the fierce determination of a girl from Locust Ridge who had grown up watching what could happen when hardworking people did not understand the rules governing their own lives. Her father had been largely illiterate and signed legal documents with an X, and Dolly never forgot what that vulnerability meant. She had watched poverty take choices away from people she loved, and when success finally gave her choices of her own, she guarded them fiercely. The hair could belong to the public imagination, the rhinestones could belong to the stage, and the jokes could belong to anyone who wanted to repeat them. But the songs, and the rights attached to those songs, would remain hers. Eventually, that principle would face its greatest test. It would not come from some anonymous Nashville executive or a struggling producer attempting to take advantage of an inexperienced songwriter. It would come from someone powerful enough that almost any young artist would have considered surrendering whatever he asked for simply for the privilege of hearing him sing one of her songs. Dolly Parton had spent years learning how to protect what she created, and now she was about to discover whether she could still say no when the person asking was the most famous entertainer in the world. By the mid-1970s, Dolly Parton had reached the point where becoming the woman she wanted to be required leaving behind the man who had helped introduce her to America. For 7 years, Porter Wagoner had been her television partner, mentor, and one of the most important figures in her early career. He had given her a national platform when few people outside Nashville knew her name. But the partnership that had once opened doors was beginning to feel like a room she could no longer remain inside. Dolly knew she had to leave, yet walking away from Porter was not simply a business decision. There was gratitude between them, history between them, and enough affection to make independence feel almost like betrayal. So Dolly did what she had always done when ordinary language seemed inadequate. She wrote a song. In just 3 minutes and 32 seconds, she somehow turned a professional separation into something deeply personal. A farewell, an apology, an expression of gratitude, and a declaration that loving someone did not mean surrendering the right to leave. Before their partnership ended, she played the song for Porter. He wept. Dolly wept with him. For a moment, everything they had shared across those 7 complicated years seemed to exist inside that melody. But when the song was over, Dolly still walked out the door. She called it "I Will Always Love You." The song reached #1 on the Billboard Country Chart in 1974, then remarkably returned to #1 in 1982 after Dolly recorded it again. But between those 2 chart triumphs, when "I Will Always Love You" had already become one of the defining country compositions of its era, Dolly received a telephone call that would test everything she had learned about ownership. The decision that followed would shape not only her financial future, but the entire architecture of Dolly Parton as a songwriter, a businesswoman, and a woman who had grown up with almost nothing and had quietly resolved that what she created would never again be taken from her. The call came from Elvis Presley's camp. Elvis wanted to record "I Will Always Love You." For Dolly, the possibility was almost overwhelming. Elvis was not simply another successful singer. In the mid-1970s, he remained one of the most commercially powerful and recognizable entertainers in America. An Elvis Presley recording could transform a song's life overnight, bringing enormous radio exposure, royalties, prestige, and an association with a legend whose name itself carried extraordinary commercial value. For the girl who had once left Locust Ridge with little more than ambition, hearing that Elvis wanted one of her songs must have felt like a confirmation almost too extraordinary to imagine. Then came the condition. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's famously hard-driving manager, informed Dolly that Elvis would record the song only if she surrendered 50% of its publishing rights. It meant giving away half of the intellectual property, half of the publishing income, and half of what that composition might generate in the future. The opportunity of a lifetime had suddenly become a choice between having Elvis Presley sing her song and continuing to own the song herself. Dolly said no, but the decision was anything but easy. She went home and wrestled with what she was about to give up. Saying no meant turning away the king of rock and roll, a man whose records were events, whose concerts drew enormous crowds, and whose influence could change another artist's career simply through association. It also meant risking the displeasure of powerful people in an industry built on relationships, access, and favors. Dolly understood all of that, which was precisely why the decision hurt so much. By her own account, she cried for days. She loved Elvis. She loved his music, and she desperately wanted to hear what his voice might do with a song that had come from one of the most emotional separations of her own life. This was not pride preventing her from accepting the deal. It was principle. Somewhere behind the successful songwriter making that decision was still the daughter of Robert Lee Parton, the largely illiterate farmer who had signed documents with an X, and the little girl who had grown up understanding how easily people without knowledge or leverage could lose what belonged to them. So Dolly cried, understood exactly what she was sacrificing, and said no anyway. Years later, she could turn the pain into one of those perfectly Dolly Parton lines, "I cried all the way to the bank." Elvis never recorded, "I will always love you." His people moved on, while the song remained where Dolly had fought to keep it. In her catalog, with its publishing rights entirely under her control, for another 17 years, that decision could have looked like one of the great missed opportunities of her career. Dolly had turned down the chance to have the most famous entertainer in the world record, perhaps her most personal song, all because she refused to surrender half of something she had created. But then, in 1992, another voice would find, "I will always love you." And the decision that had once left Dolly in tears would become one of the most consequential acts of self-belief in the history of popular music. In 1992, 17 years after Dolly Parton had made the painful decision to protect her song, rather than surrender half of it for the chance to have Elvis Presley record it, "I Will Always Love You" found another voice. Whitney Houston, a 29-year-old singer from Newark, New Jersey, recorded it for the soundtrack of The Bodyguard. What emerged was not simply a faithful cover of Dolly's country ballad. Houston transformed it into something entirely her own. A reimagining built around restraint, silence, and then a vocal performance of such extraordinary power that, for millions of listeners around the world, her version would come to eclipse the original in popular memory. The numbers were astonishing. Whitney Houston's "I Will Always Love You" spent 14 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, sold more than 20 million copies worldwide, and became the best-selling single ever recorded by a female artist. But behind every record sold and every radio play was a decision Dolly had made almost 2 decades earlier. Because she had refused to surrender her publishing rights, the royalties generated by the composition continued flowing to its songwriter. Whitney's recording alone would ultimately earn Dolly an estimated $20 million. There was an extraordinary symmetry to it. A song Dolly had written because she needed the courage to leave Porter Wagoner had now rewarded her because, years later, she had found the courage to walk away from Elvis Presley's offer. The millions were born not from a moment of certainty, but from a moment of grief. Dolly could not have known what would happen 17 years later when she sat with the knowledge that Elvis wanted her song, but his camp wanted half of its publishing. She could not have known that Whitney Houston would one day sing it, that The Bodyguard would become a phenomenon, or that the song would travel farther than almost anything else she had ever written. All she knew was that it belonged to her, and that was enough. That is why the decision reveals Dolly Parton's business genius more clearly than almost any balance sheet ever could. The remarkable part was not simply that the choice eventually made her millions. It was that she had been willing to make it before those millions existed. Saying no required her to turn down the most powerful entertainer in the world without any guarantee that another opportunity would ever come. It required her to believe that the value of her work did not depend on Elvis Presley or anyone else, placing his name beside it. She had to trust the song, trust herself, and trust that something created honestly could possess a value no larger celebrity could manufacture for it. In a sense, Dolly had been learning that lesson since Locust Ridge. Her mother had once taken scraps of discarded fabric, stitched them together while telling her daughter the biblical story of Joseph, and transformed poverty into something sacred enough for Dolly to remember for the rest of her life. Years later, Dolly transformed that memory into a coat of many colors. The principle beneath both stories was remarkably similar. The story you tell about a thing determines what that thing becomes, and the thing you truly own is the one thing no one else can take away from you. By the time Whitney Houston's version of I Will Always Love You completed its historic chart run, Dolly had spent decades applying that principle to everything she created. Her publishing catalog eventually grew to more than 3,000 songs, each representing another piece of a life translated into words and melody and retained under her control. That catalog has been estimated at more than $150 million, and even that extraordinary figure represents only one part of the larger fortune she built. It does not include Dollywood, her other royalties, real estate, film and television interests, licensing agreements, merchandise, or the vast philanthropic infrastructure she would eventually create with the wealth her career produced. The catalog itself is something more intimate. It is the accumulated value of mornings when Dolly woke at 3 or 4 while everyone else was sleeping, of melodies captured in hotel rooms and tour buses, of lyrics scribbled onto whatever paper happened to be nearby, and of 6 decades spent turning private memories into songs strangers could recognize as their own. Thousands of songs about love, poverty, faith, heartbreak, home, loneliness, family, and survival. And Dolly had made certain that the words and melodies remained hers. That ownership had been defended most dramatically in the mid-1970s, when a woman who had once grown up with almost nothing was offered something almost any songwriter would have considered impossible to refuse. She could have chosen Elvis Presley and surrendered half the song. Instead, through tears, she chose the work itself. 17 years later, Whitney Houston's voice demonstrated just how consequential that decision had been. And perhaps that choice, more than the towering wigs, rhinestones, carefully exaggerated image, or even the enormous fortune that followed, reveals the clearest version of Dolly Parton. Beneath the woman who spent a lifetime making herself look larger than life was someone who understood exactly where her real value lived. She could laugh at the costume, share the spotlight, and allow the world to underestimate her intelligence. But when it came to the things she had created, she knew precisely what they were worth, and she refused to give them away. How much all of that ultimately made Dolly Parton worth is a more complicated question. The number depends on who you ask. In June 2025, Forbes estimated Dolly Parton's net worth at approximately $450 million, placing her 78th among America's wealthiest self-made women. Celebrity net worth, using a broader method for valuing her holdings, arrived at a considerably larger figure, roughly $650 million. A difference of $200 million might seem enormous, but in Dolly's case, the gap says less about inaccurate accounting than it does about the unusual nature of the empire being measured. After 6 decades, what she had created had become so layered. Music, publishing, entertainment, tourism, licensing, property, and philanthropy, that reducing it to a single number was almost an exercise in approximation. Dolly was not a technology founder whose fortune could be calculated from shares in one publicly traded company. She had not inherited a corporation, married into extraordinary wealth, or created one product that suddenly reached $1 billion valuation. She had begun as a songwriter from a 2-room cabin in Sevier County, Tennessee, and built her fortune slowly. One song, one contract, one refusal, and one carefully considered decision at a time. By the time financial analysts attempted to calculate what all of it was worth, her business interests had become so deeply woven into American culture that a spreadsheet could capture the assets without fully capturing the story behind them. At the center of everything was the catalog. More than 3,000 songs accumulated across 6 decades of writing, often during those quiet hours at 3 or 4 in the morning when the rest of the world was still asleep. More important than the number was the ownership. Dolly retained her publishing rights with a determination that remained unusual in an industry historically built around separating artists from the intellectual property they created. Her catalog has been estimated to be worth more than $150 million, encompassing not only the songs that became inseparable from her name, Jolene, Coat of Many Colors, 9 to 5, and I Will Always Love You, but thousands of other compositions recorded by artists, licensed for film and television, reinterpreted across genres, and heard around the world for generations. Together, those songs have been estimated to generate approximately $85 million annually in royalties. The remarkable part is that the income does not depend on one surviving hit. It represents the cumulative weight of thousands of individual acts of creation, each beginning as an idea in Dolly's mind and each continuing to possess value long after the morning when she first put it on paper. What she protected in those early negotiations was therefore never merely money. She was protecting the future earning power of her own imagination. Then there was Dollywood, the largest non-musical asset associated with her fortune. Built in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, from the foundation of the earlier Silver Dollar City attraction. The theme park became something far more meaningful than another celebrity investment. Dolly's stake has been estimated at approximately $165 million, while the park attracts roughly 3 million visitors each year. But its significance cannot be measured only through attendance figures or valuation. Dollywood created jobs, attracted tourism, and generated economic activity in Sevier County, the same place where Dolly had entered the world with almost nothing. That circle was difficult to ignore. Her father had once signed legal documents with an X because no one had taught him to write his own name. His daughter grew up, learned how contracts worked, fought to retain ownership of her creations, accumulated hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, and then helped build an economic engine almost within sight of the mountains that had shaped her childhood. Dolly did not escape Sevier County and erase it from the story of her success. She carried it with her until she possessed enough power to bring some of that success home. Beyond Dollywood and the publishing catalog were numerous additional streams of wealth, each reflecting another deliberate expansion of the Dolly Parton enterprise. Film and television became significant parts of her career, particularly beginning with 9 to 5 in 1980 and the Academy Award-nominated title song, followed by decades of acting, producing, soundtrack work, and licensing. Brand partnerships transformed the unmistakable Dolly image into a commercial property, appearing on products ranging from perfume and cookbooks to holiday merchandise, allowing the persona she had so carefully constructed to become an asset in its own right. Her wealth also extended into real estate, including the Willow Lake Plantation property in Brentwood, Tennessee. Yet even as the numbers grew, Dolly rarely seemed interested in displaying wealth simply to prove that she possessed it. That was another contradiction at the center of her public identity. Almost nothing about her appearance was understated, yet much of the machinery producing her fortune operated quietly. The rhinestones announced themselves. The wigs were impossible to miss. Behind them was a woman reading contracts, protecting copyrights, diversifying income, acquiring assets, and making decisions whose financial consequences would continue for decades. Perhaps the most revealing part of the fortune, however, was what Dolly chose to do with it. Philanthropy was never merely an activity separate from the business empire, something added after enough money had accumulated. It became part of the architecture of what she was building because Dolly seemed to understand wealth in a way that reached back to the deprivation of Locust Ridge. Money could provide security, independence, and control, but after a certain point, its meaning depended on what happened when it left your hands. For Dolly Parton, generosity was not the opposite of financial intelligence. When executed with the same discipline and precision she applied to songwriting, ownership, and business, giving money away could become another form of investment. Only this time, the return was measured in children who learned to read, families given another chance, communities strengthened, and strangers whose lives might become slightly less difficult than the one she had known as a child. In that sense, the difference between $450 million and $650 million may ultimately be one of the least interesting things about Dolly Parton's fortune. The more revealing question is what a girl who grew up with almost nothing decided money was actually for once she finally had more than she could ever need. And the answer can be found not in the rhinestones or the balance sheets, but in what she quietly began giving back. In 2020, as COVID-19 swept across the world and a vaccine still seemed more like a desperate hope than an approaching reality, Dolly Parton quietly made another decision about what her money was for. She donated $1 million to Vanderbilt University Medical Center to support coronavirus research, work that would contribute directly to the development of the Moderna vaccine. She did not publicize the gift simply to collect praise. She spoke about it because she hoped that if people saw her give, others with the means to help might do the same. And they did. 2 years later, the scale of her philanthropy reached another extraordinary level. In 2022, Jeff Bezos presented Dolly with $100 million through his Courage and Civility Award, recognizing her record of giving and allowing her complete freedom to decide how the money should be used. Much of it would ultimately flow toward the causes that had always mattered most to her: libraries, literacy programs, and the Imagination Library, the initiative she had created in 1995 and nurtured for decades into one of the most remarkable literacy efforts in the world. The idea behind the Imagination Library was almost painfully simple. From birth until the age of 5, every enrolled child would receive a book in the mail each month, delivered directly to the family home without the parents paying anything. By the time of Dolly's death, the program had distributed more than 260 million books to children across 5 countries. Behind that enormous number was a memory Dolly never managed, or perhaps never wanted, to forget. She had grown up in a home where books were scarce, and she knew what it meant for knowledge to feel like something other families possessed. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, had been largely illiterate and had signed his name with an X. Decades later, his daughter built a program designed to make sure millions of children encountered books before poverty or circumstance could convince them that reading belonged to someone else. There is something almost impossible to reduce to statistics in that transformation. The daughter of a man who could not write his own name ultimately placed more than 260 million books into the hands of children she would never meet. That is why the mathematics of Dolly Parton's fortune, whether the final estimate is $450 million or $650 million, is ultimately less revealing than the architecture behind it. She did not build wealth primarily by taking something from someone else. She created, protected what she created, and repeatedly refused to surrender ownership when powerful people presented contracts that benefited them more than they honored her. She had learned the importance of that independence in Locust Ridge, demonstrated it when she turned down Elvis Presley's terms, and watched its extraordinary consequences unfold 17 years later when Whitney Houston transformed "I Will Always Love You" into a worldwide phenomenon. Across the 6 decades between those moments, Dolly built something whose significance eventually became difficult to express in dollars alone. Every song retained, every publishing decision, every investment, and every business she helped create became part of an empire rooted in the same principles she had learned when there was almost nothing to protect. She had built it herself, and once she possessed enough, she began using that independence to give other people opportunities that poverty had once denied her. Perhaps that is the most moving way to understand the fortune. Somewhere among the millions of children who opened those packages from the Imagination Library was a little girl or boy who would never know Dolly personally, never understand the contracts she had refused or the mornings she had awakened at 3 o'clock to write songs. They would simply know that once a month, a book arrived with their name on it. They might never realize that the woman responsible had once been a child much like them. A child growing up with very little, in a family where books were scarce and her father signed his name with an X. And while the world measured what Dolly had accumulated, Brian Siver had been quietly carrying knowledge of a different kind. For years, he had known that another responsibility was waiting for him somewhere in the future, something Dolly herself had asked him to prepare for. It remained in the background of ordinary days, impossible to forget even when there was no reason yet to speak about it. His father, Larry, had served as Dolly Parton's head of security before him, and Brian eventually followed him into the same role. 2 generations of one family had therefore stood beside Dolly through different chapters of the same extraordinary life, entrusted with protecting a woman whose face belonged to the world but whose private self remained fiercely guarded. And now Brian was approaching the responsibility no security detail could ever prepare a person to carry. Not protecting Dolly Parton from the world, but helping the world say goodbye to her. In her final months, Dolly Parton had been dealing quietly. and with the same characteristic understatement she had brought to hardship throughout her life, with dehydration, dizziness, and kidney stones. After Carl Dean's death, she had finally begun paying closer attention to her own health. But even then, she approached illness the way she had approached almost everything painful. Acknowledge only what needed to be acknowledged, make as little fuss as possible, and keep moving. At 80 years old, after more than 6 decades of work, Dolly still had not truly learned how to stop. There was still another project waiting for her, Dolly, a true original musical, the Broadway production she had co-written, and which was scheduled to open in December 2026, was intended to become something close to a theatrical summation of an existence that had always possessed its own sense of theater. The girl from Locust Ridge had turned herself into one of the most recognizable figures in American culture, and now her story was supposed to reach a Broadway stage in her own words and music. Whether that production will continue as planned, or what form it might ultimately take, has not yet been announced. Those decisions now belong to the people entrusted with an estate estimated somewhere between $450 million and $650 million. It is an extraordinary fortune, but one without biological heirs. Dolly and Carl never had children, a fact she discussed over the years with the same equanimity she brought to so many deeply personal subjects. She had, as she once put it, mothered the whole world instead. And perhaps nowhere was that idea made more tangible than through the imagination library. If Dolly never had a child of her own, then that program became, in a sense, her child, and the more than 260 million books it distributed became part of the inheritance she chose to leave behind. Some of the children who once received those books are adults now. Some have children of their own and have enrolled their sons and daughters in the same program, watching another generation open packages containing books sent, because a woman they may never meet remembered what it felt like to grow up without enough of them. In the most literal way Dolly could make possible, those families became part of something larger than philanthropy. They became part of her extended family, connected across generations by stories. In the months ahead, there will inevitably be questions about the money. There may be legal proceedings, estate decisions, disputes over valuations, and arguments concerning assets whose precise worth was never completely transparent during Dolly's lifetime. People may emerge with claims, memories, and competing versions of events. That is what often follows when a fortune of this magnitude changes hands. There is nothing particularly glamorous about it. It is the ordinary machinery that begins after an extraordinary life ends. Lawyers, accountants, documents, courts, valuations, signatures, and the slow bureaucratic transformation of a living human being into something the law calls an estate. But the songs will not go through probate. They will simply keep playing. Jolene will continue finding new listeners. Coat of Many Colors will continue carrying the memory of a mother stitching scraps together while teaching her daughter that poverty did not have to mean shame. 9 to 5 Inches will continue appearing in offices, films, playlists, and those private corners of memory where certain songs become permanently attached to periods of our lives. And I Will Always Love You will remain. The version Dolly recorded herself, the version Whitney Houston transformed into the best-selling single ever recorded by a female artist, and every interpretation by every singer who encountered those words and recognized within them something they had once desperately wanted to say. Dolly had originally written that song about leaving. It was a farewell to Porter Wagoner, the man who had helped shape the beginning of her national career, written at a moment when gratitude and independence had become impossible to separate. Yet over time, the song grew larger than the circumstances that created it. It became a farewell that could belong to anyone who had ever loved someone deeply enough to understand that sometimes leaving does not erase love. Dolly wrote it while standing at a threshold, unable to know what waited on the other side, and perhaps that is why it endured. She spent her life riding toward things she could not yet see. Again and again, she trusted the song before she knew what the song would become. She trusted the work before anyone could tell her what it might someday be worth. Most importantly, she trusted that what she created possessed a value that another person's fame could enhance but could never manufacture or replace, not even Elvis Presley's. When powerful men arrived with contracts asking for pieces of what belonged to her, Dolly learned when to walk away. She held on to the work, kept writing, and continued waking at 3 or 4 in the morning, when the world was finally quiet enough for her to hear whatever melody or memory had come looking for her. At the same time, she kept sending books to children who might never understand the extraordinary distance those books had traveled before reaching their hands. She kept stepping onto stages in rhinestones, makeup, towering wigs, and the extravagant image she had constructed with such precision. Yet perhaps that image had always contained an echo of something much older. Her mother sitting in poverty, stitching scraps of fabric into a coat while telling her daughter the biblical story of Joseph. Both mother and daughter possessed the same remarkable instinct: to take what was scarce, overlooked, or ordinary and transform it into something sacred. By any financial measure, Dolly Parton died as one of the wealthiest self-made women in American history. Yet she also died having given away sums greater than most people will ever earn, while still retaining ownership of the work that had made much of that generosity possible. She owned what she wrote because she had understood very early that independence was not something success automatically granted you. It was something you had to protect. Perhaps that is what the rhinestones ultimately represented. They were beautiful, certainly, and deliberately excessive, but they were also armor. The glittering protection of a woman from Locust Ridge who understood the difference between the image the world consumed and the person underneath it. Long before anyone had reason to believe she could succeed, Dolly had decided that the things she created would remain hers. Then she spent the rest of her life proving what could happen when a woman refused to surrender ownership of her own voice. So when the arguments over the estate eventually quiet down, when the valuations have been completed and the paperwork has been signed, something much larger will remain untouched by any balance sheet. More than 3,000 songs will still exist. The diary Dolly said she had been writing in melody and verse for 6 decades. Millions of books will remain in homes around the world. Children who receive them will become parents, and some of those parents will watch another Dolly Parton book arrive for another child. The fortune will eventually be distributed. The properties will have new stewards. But the work will continue moving through lives she could never possibly have known. Leave a tribute in the comments for Dolly Parton, the girl from Locust Ridge who grew up with almost nothing and learned to own every word she wrote. What is the lesson of a life like hers? What does it mean to build something so enormous from so little and then spend decades giving so much of it back? Perhaps the answer is somewhere inside those 3,000 songs, inside that 60-year diary she left behind. The record of a life that, beneath all the wigs, rhinestones, fame, grief, and fortune, remained unmistakably and completely her own. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the lives behind these legends, because extraordinary people deserve to be remembered not only for the ending of their stories, but also for what they created, what they contributed, and what they left behind.